Thank you for being with us today, wherever in the world you may be joining us from, or as the case may be, watching a recording of this conversation after the fact. But for all of our live viewers, you're in for a real treat, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the hour. I'm Lawrence Cho with Clavecin Society, a nonprofit organization based in usually sunny California in the United States. By engaging with accomplished musicians such as today's guest, whom I'll introduce shortly, we further our mission to support unique musical voices, those who not only engage in music making at the highest level, but also take it upon themselves to share their craft with the broadest audiences possible. Unique doesn't even begin to describe Skip Sempé, no doubt one of those legendary figures who's been so deeply embedded in the fabric of his field that any serious discussion of early music in the past half century must involve some reflection on his enormous contributions to the performance and recorded history of its repertoire in modern times, as well as his influence on the current discourse surrounding the field. And instead of rattling off a laundry list of all the names he's studied or worked with or all of the recordings he's made, I'll just say this. Skip's led a multifaceted half century career, not just as a virtuoso performer and improviser, but also as a brilliant conductor, pedagogue, essayist, and shall I say, charismatic popularizer of early music. And to his many friends and colleagues, he's an incredible character with an infectious warmth, generosity, and larger than life personality. But ultimately, and I think the reason, I brought us to have this conversation today is that as I've come to talk with Skip this past year, I found that he's had a lot to say, not just about the nuts and bolts of the business and about the minutia of the harpsichord or early music, but really about the fundamental matters that really underscore why we do it all. Things like interpretation, taste, creativity, and really how to keep it all alive and accessible, and creative and performing at the highest level to a new generation of audiences. So, here's Skip joining us from his home in France. Hi, Skip. How are you doing this evening?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah. And so as you might realize, Skip is joining us over there from France, but of course, I'm here in California. We have audiences from all over the world. I just want to start, Skip, by just saying that much of our audience here is likely familiar, at least some familiarity with the world of early music, and some idea of the prevailing approaches, maybe even the diversity of approaches toward performance, instruments, instrumentation, interpretation, and they're also probably familiar with some of your work personally. But I think it's worth maybe acquainting our viewers with some of your beginnings. And by beginnings, I don't mean maybe since you were crawling out of the womb, but maybe just beginnings in terms of some of the past decades, just because I think it ties nicely into why you've gone into what your where your interests are now. And I think a lot of people forget that really in the early days, maybe not even the real early days, but certainly in your time and in the days of your immediate predecessors, people didn't just, at least generally, didn't pick this up when they were 2 years old and then go get a harpsichord degree. I mean, that wasn't the really obvious thing to do. You had to engage in some level of self-discovery of a very new sound and approach toward music. And I remember you saying that, even when you were 10, you had been exposed to some of these new sounds and ideas, which I think is probably very rare. So, yeah, I mean, how did you get into it all? And how did that take you to what you're doing now with Capriccio Stravagante and all of this work that goes far beyond, the maybe solo harpsichord recordings that maybe many of our audience may know you well for?
Well, I grew up in New Orleans, and so since uh, there were no concerts of any sort of music before 1800 on original instruments when I was growing up. Um, uh, Occasionally there was a visiting European ensemble, um, and there was also a semi-professional group called the New Orleans Music de Camera, which I played with for several years right before I left New Orleans. And I discovered the repertoire uh, basically on recordings which had been made in Europe. And I also began forming a library, which is now way too big, probably. Um, and I got into the habit of writing my name and the date in the book. So for years and years, I would see 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971. Didn't particularly shock me until I got much older and realized that I'd been doing this since I was about 10 years old. And I was really much more interested in instrumental music at that point and musical instruments than I was interested in vocal music and voices. There's something about musical instruments and musical instrument making uh, and the technique of playing all sorts of different musical instruments that fascinated me. And so I built a clavichord and a harpsichord with my father when I was a teenager, and I was playing both of the instruments. I picked up the recorder, and then I picked up the Gothic harp, and the group that I was performing in was doing a lot of Gothic repertoire, a lot of Cicogna, uh, Machaut, Landini. So I developed a taste and a love for not only music before 1800 with so-called period instruments, but music before 1400 or 1500 or even 1300. And so this lifelong obsession uh, with musical instruments uh, and instrumental music turned into a lifetime obsession with um, with musicians, with instrumentalists. And so the entire idea of putting together a group was based on the idea of having a group of instrumentalists for whatever repertoire. Many people want a choir, they form a choir, they're interested in vocal music or religious music. I was mostly interested in secular music and instrumental music. That changed and developed over the years, of course. But that's the way it all began. It began with books and lots of reading and lots of library work, uh, and a lot of hands-on experience with musical instruments, which in New Orleans at that point were extremely rare.
And then, as many people know, it Capriccio Stravagante was, formed, basically 4 decades ago. The all the facets that Capriccio Stravagante has undertaken over the years, really, all of that began in 1986. And so, what was the evolution, I guess, to go from, all the experiences you had there with some notion of this grand sound of an ensemble, to the beginnings of Capriccio Stravagante.
Yes, well, I also didn't mention that for a few years I played the cello, and I had to stop because it was there was a lot of resistance between me and the cello. But what I did develop a taste for was the bow, and at some point, much later, the bow came back as a source of inspiration, which is one of the reasons why I've dedicated a lot of the instrumental repertoire that we've done to violin music and gamba music. But that early fascination with a bowed stringed instrument uh, really put me on the track of the magic of the bow and bowing and the kind of articulation that comes from all those subtleties of how exactly to use the bow, because it's not just a question of up bow and down bow. It's a question of the speed of the bow and the intention of the bow stroke, where exactly the notes end, and all sorts of magical things like that, which really do make the music more articulate and therefore more what has come to be called rhetorical.
Yeah, do you have some feeling that, when you look back historically, not to mention folks like Bach, but really every, most significant composers knew how to play a bowed string instrument or a or a wind instrument. They probably knew how to sing reasonably well. I mean, this modern culture of kind of mono instrumentalist is really something that one has to break the mold of to really I mean, I don't know, does this mono instrumentalism, does that come into conflict with the ethos of early music? And have you do you feel like you're able to pierce that with your previous experiences?
Well, I think that a lot of experience with different kinds of instruments, it gives you an experience with the different instrumental techniques, and it also gives you a lot of insight, which can then turn into experience of uh, how to actually coach people and fix instrumental problems or bowing problems, or how to mix viols with recorders, how to mix viols and recorders with harpsichords or lutes or harps. Uh, and that's why uh, the project that finally came to fascinate me the most was this concept of a Renaissance orchestra, which is something that we actually didn't invent in Capriccio Stravagante. It's really the only proper Renaissance orchestra in the world today. People will occasionally put together a Renaissance orchestra for a certain number of projects that require them, but one which is sort of operational and uses this as a as an independent expressive and musical device. I don't know. In a way, the Renaissance Orchestra, I would suppose, was invented in the 70s by David Monroe, when the Early Music Consort of London performed as basically what I would call a Renaissance orchestra. And the only thing that really came along between the Early Music Consort of London with David Monroe and the Capriccio Stravagante Renaissance Orchestra was actually a project which Jordi Savall did in the 70s, which was a recording of William Braid. And that recording for Deutsche Harmonie Mundi was a landmark because it actually was a Renaissance orchestra. It was called Hesperian 20 instead of the Hesperian 20 Renaissance Orchestra. But those two things are the only things that really came along, except for perhaps the big projects of the New York Pro Musica in the 50s and 60s. But at this point, one really only calls on a Renaissance orchestra to do the Pellegrina, which is the Florentine Intermedi of 1589 for the Medici weddings in Florence. And of course, the two most important Renaissance orchestra uh, pieces that are known to the public, which are the Monteverdi 1610 Vespers and Orfeo. Both of those works absolutely require what I refer to as a Renaissance orchestra. And the Renaissance orchestra didn't really last for that long. It lasted for about 5 decades. And then it turned into something else where the intention of the orchestration was not to mix different consorts.
And not to jump the gun here, I think maybe some of our audience are maybe not familiar with the ins and outs of your rendition of the Renaissance orchestra sound, and maybe just give them some insight briefly into what the Capriccio Stravagante Renaissance orchestra looks like.
Well, it's based more or less around a viol consort, um, because that was such a popular instrumental consort for amateurs and for professionals. Um, the viol consort and the recorder consort uh, were used independently. They were used together. You could also add the corneti and the sackbuts to that with any number of percussion instruments or percussion players. And then there were all the Renaissance reed instruments and capped reed instruments like the shawm uh, and the Krummhorns, the Rauschpfeifen, all of these capped wind instruments, reed instruments, which went along with the régal. And then you had, of course, the pluck stringed instruments. You had gut and metal strung lutes of all sorts of different sizes, pandoras, orpharions. You had instruments that went between London and Hamburg and Copenhagen and Rome and Venice. Then you had all the different sizes of harps, virginals, harpsichords. So you wind up with an orchestra in which there were none of those instruments actually survived into a modern orchestra, except the violins, which of course are no longer Baroque violins with gut strings and played with a lighter bow. So the Renaissance orchestra is something that really fascinates people who are used to hearing symphony orchestras, because we very often play in very large halls, because the Renaissance orchestra can go up to about 25 people. So very often the halls in which we play are the same halls where you have a symphony orchestra, but none of the instruments are the same. And that really fascinates uh, listeners. I mean, in a Baroque orchestra, you have instruments that actually became, in one way or another, a classical orchestra, and then a romantic orchestra, and then a late 19th or 20th century orchestra. But the Renaissance orchestra actually stopped around 1640 or 50 or 60, because many of the instruments which were used in it, like krumhorns or cornetti, for instance, weren't really played very much after that. And the repertoire, a lot of which was dance music or occasional music, just it was buried in time.
So you've talked about, working on, works like the Pellegrina, some of these other things which maybe are more traditionally associated with a Renaissance orchestra sound. Um, but maybe talk a little bit about what you're working on now, because I think it's quite interesting. A lot of people might not think that some of the things that you're working on now would be associated with this large Renaissance orchestra sound, and your ideas behind that. I mean, just a lot of people maybe perhaps were surprised that you would work on your current project in the context of a Renaissance orchestra.
Well, I'll never forget, in the early '80s, Franz Bruggen was interviewed uh, in the Dutch or the German press. I can't remember exactly which, and they said, "Well, you're one of the finest and most well-known recorder players in the world. Why would you want to have an orchestra?" And he basically said, "Well, you know, the recorder repertoire for solo instrument is a bit limited, and I wanted to adventure into other music, and orchestra music of the 18th and early 19th century interested me." So that was I thought that was a very interesting thing that Bruggen said in this interview. And in fact, at the beginning, I really was most interested in playing solo harpsichord concerts and making solo harpsichord recordings. And little by little, uh, I realized that I was missing the whole chamber music experience by not doing chamber music, because I was really, really interested in the repertoire. And when I moved to Europe in 1980, there were very, very few Baroque chamber music ensembles. There was the Leonhardt Consort, there was the ensembles that the Kaukins had, there was Musik Antiqua Köln, and there was London Baroque. And those are the four groups that actually had all of the prestigious recordings for all the prestigious labels and all the prestigious concerts. And so there were not really that many groups focused on instrumental chamber music in those days. And then, of course, in the late 70s and 80s, everyone began forming so-called Baroque orchestras. But that's really not the same thing as the one on a part chamber ensembles. It's a different musical experience. It's a different rehearsal experience, and of course, it's a different repertoire.
Right, but I mean, but I think viewers will find very interesting, what you're working on right now. In the Dowland Lacrime.
Well,
Just because,
the
it's not
Dowland.
a traditional orchestral kind of thing, right?
Yes, well, one of the things that we're working on at the moment is the release of a new recording of the Dowland Lacrime. So the Dowland Lacrime is historically it's been done with five viols and a lute. Dowland wrote out five parts for a five-part instrumental ensemble. And then there's a lute part, which is a bit sketchy, in fact. They can't be played as lute solos because very often the top voice is missing from the lute tablature. So what the lute did, and whether the lute part was optional, is a question that at some point people began to ask. In any case, if you studied the music, the five-part music in depth, and you studied the lute tablature in depth, what becomes clear is that the polyphonic writing, I mean, the quality, the intensity, the expertise of the polyphonic writing in the five-part pieces is much, much, much finer than the surviving lute part. Dowland published the lute part. It maybe is something that he did himself, but it's a little bit like some other sources between 1600 and 1615 or 20. It's sort of a combination between uh, a written out version of the five parts and a sort of basso continuo part. It's really a kind of writing that was only present, uh, yeah, at least in print culture, for I would say 15 or 20, at the most 25 years. So one of the things that we were uh, able to do with the Renaissance Orchestra instrumentation is that we were able to transfer the lute tablature to two virginals and a harpsichord. So you hear parts of the lute tablature, which are sort of a reduction of the five parts, but you also hear this sort of very undocumented and unknown and not very much studied sort of early continuo part of this kind that existed between 1600 and 1620. So it's an adventure in sounds. It's an adventure in the layering of musical and acoustic information. And what the consorts actually do when they play together is that they amplify each other. Because in our time, we think of amplification as something which is electronic. But before electricity, uh, musicians and acousticians had different ways of actually amplifying things. It could be something as simple as performing appropriate music for a very live acoustic in a very live acoustic. That's a kind of amplification before electricity. And the idea of two instruments amplifying each other is something that Olivier Fortin and I started doing on two harpsichords in 1998, because we realized that actually one harpsichord was amplifying the other. And that's why it sounds so loud and so rich. It also has something to do with a very special manner of playing the instruments. But the idea actually came from the idea of one instrument amplifying the sound and the gesture of the other instrument. And that's a very special interpretive talent, actually. And it's something which applies to musical instruments. It's not a vocal technique. It's not something that solo or consort voices or choir voices do. This is something which is an instrumental technique. It's an instrumental conception for instrumental music, and it's very, very important to really develop that as much as we can. It's true that the voice is a great inspiration, and that the voice is perhaps the most perfect musical instrument. I mean, it's at least to receive wisdom, but people were already saying this in 1500 and 1550 and 1600. Um, but I think that the supremacy of the voice actually comes from the time before 1550, when musical instruments had not evolved into what they evolved into around 1550. Because around 1550, musical instruments simply got bigger. Instruments before 1500 were 4-foot instruments. They were at rather relatively high pitches, but the idea of bass trombones, of really big harpsichords, of bigger harps, this is something which comes after 1550. And you also have the great school of the first amatis in Cremona, with instruments from the 1550s, 60s, 70s. You have Italian viols from those years. And those instruments are really the beginning of what we consider today to be the finest lutherie, the finest stringed instrument making that we know of. That's when that tradition of Stradivari and Guarneri, that's when it began. It actually began in the middle of the 16th century. And that's also the birth of what I have come to call the Renaissance Orchestra. It's a celebration of the fact that these instruments were perfected way before Bach wrote a cantata, or Handel or Corelli wrote a concerto grosso.
And even I mean, on the slightly switching gears here, on the topic of instruments, I mean, over the years, you've assembled, not only a great performing collection of keyboard instruments, but you yourself, have all sorts of other instruments, stringed instruments, wind instruments. I guess how does that come into play in terms of supporting this idea of assembling, such a, this multifaceted ensemble?
Well, my fascination, I mean, collecting instruments comes from a love of the instruments themselves. Some of my instruments I actually have at home. A great number of my instruments are actually on loan to members of the group and colleagues and uh, and students, because what's really important to the most important instrumentalists is really very important instruments which really are at the absolute top of the line. So the idea has always been to have a collection of extremely fine instruments, either for my own use or for the use of the group. And of course, along the way, we've gotten very lucky. We have instruments that belonged to the Leonhards, that belonged to the Harmoncourts, that belonged to Martin and Suzanne Skowronek. Uh, we have, we've, they found us, uh, and some of those instruments are really just extraordinary. And we've always been in contact with very fine harpsichord makers, um, gamba makers, violin makers, I mean, bow makers. Uh, the the Capriccio, since it began, has been really full of instrumentalists who really enjoy playing on the finest instruments that they can get their hands on. And some of them, especially for the younger musicians, are not affordable. So the only thing to do is to locate them and then to have them loaned. So I've also spent a lot of time on the project of spreading these instruments around, in fact.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, what are your maybe what are your thoughts on almost the the situation regarding instrument building today? Perhaps I mean, is even keyboard instrument building, and what it will mean for the next generation of performers, young performers who have to hopefully get an instrument or two at some point in the near future.
Well, instrument making has evolved. Making Renaissance and Baroque styled instruments. It's evolved. It's evolved a lot. I mean, the research that was necessary uh, in the 50s to get these things going by the end of the 50s or the early 1960s. Um, there's a lot of progress that's been made since then, but the initial progress comes from the mid 50s to 1970. And since 1970, a lot of makers have come along who realized how things could be done even better, different pitches, uh, different kinds of wire for different schools of harpsichord making for different pitches. The recorder world has undergone a lot of transformation in the last 20 years as well. Uh, because in the 60s and 70s, there were two or three extraordinarily fine recorder makers around um, in Boston, in Australia, for instance, in Amsterdam. Uh, and they had very, very long waiting lists, and their instruments were expensive. And since then, these traditions and these secrets have been passed down to students and students of students. And so the instruments are now more readily available than they were in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So now we have basically what we need for the current and the next generation. Um, some of the instruments are still too expensive for students and younger performers, but there are always there are always ways of solving that problem.
Yeah, so actually, what do you see as, some of the biggest challenges actually facing, broadly speaking, early music today? I think we've even had one question that was submitted before our conversation about, how do we keep all this stuff alive and relevant for audiences going forward?
Well, uh, I think that there's an overlooked fact. Um, Everyone seems to be of the opinion that there has to be more music education in schools, that young children really need access to classical music, to any kind of music for that matter, but to classical music in particular, since it's, well, I mean, you have the radio, you have recordings, you have the internet where you have so much, but it depends upon the curiosity of the individual and what they're learning in school, what they're being exposed to as children in school. So now it's very popular. It's been very popular for decades to say that the only way forward uh, is music education in schools when children are quite small. But at this juncture, uh, the, the thing that I referred to just before, what's really important at this juncture is that the responsibility of bringing classical music in live performances and in recorded performances, this is based on the competence level of concert organizers, uh, agents, and the people who run artists and repertoire for record labels. And the standard in those three areas is, in my opinion, not high enough at the moment uh, because uh, concert organizers, people that work for record labels, and artist managers, they might go on business or they might go on instinct or both, but many people in very high positions are simply not professional listeners. And this idea of professional listeners is something that I'm really interested and excited about, in fact, because we have uh, amateur musicians and professional musicians, but it's also very important to realize that we also have amateur listeners and professional listeners. And the real professionals of the music world can't be amateur listeners, and they can't just be doing it for business. The direct result of their lack of knowledge is that they are concentrating too much on the artists and who is flavor of the month and not enough on the repertoire. What's important in classical music is the repertoire, the epoque, the composers. The performers do a good job or a bad job or anywhere in between. Could depend upon the day of the week for that matter. And of course, performers are extremely important, but the ones that are the most important are the ones with whom you can tell that they absolutely adore music from the very first thing that you hear from them on a recording or a live performance. That is what the magic is. It's an immediate draw to the listener, and it's a transport mechanism for a listener. That is what makes people love music as children or as adults. You can discover music of any kind at any age. Um, but it requires a sensitivity for which there's no training. That's to say that there's training for a musician, but there is no training for an artist manager or a record label executive or uh, there's no training for a music critic either. And I think that this training can only be given by musicians. I think it can only be done by musicians. The business part of the music business is a separate issue. Business is business. But music is music, and a lifetime dedication to music is far more important than what we are promoting very young or artists who are too young. We're putting too much responsibility on the youngest generation because the youngest generation of musicians is there to learn and to enrich their experiences. They're not there to teach. It's the oldest people of all the generations who are the people who are there to teach. And they're the people that one has to learn from. It's logical. It makes sense in every other field. It should be acceptable in the world of classical music as well.
Yeah, and in fact, on that note, I know that, I mean, throughout your career, but certainly, over the past decade or two, you've made a lot of strides toward, being involved with pedagogy and developing younger artists' careers. And even with a lot of your, your brilliant essays, communicating a lot of these ideas to a broader audience. I guess, how do you see yourself fitting in? I mean, do you think this is a very natural outpouring of someone who loves and breathes this stuff? You're naturally going to do that, or have you really made an explicit effort to really, further that part of your career?
Well, one of the uh, one of the most interesting experiences with younger performers was a few years ago. I uh, I did I was on the jury of of four different events. The solo harpsichord competitions in Leipzig, Bruges, and Rouen, and the final exams in the Amsterdam Conservatory. So I heard 122 harpsichordists, young harpsichordists, in the space of about 2 or 3 months. And that was a really interesting experience because one would like to think that every musician is different and that every career is different. But the level of standardization among the 122 people, harpsichord students or young harpsichordists, the level was the level was good, the level was acceptable in a way, but only 5 or 6 of these people really, really stood out as outstanding harpsichordists and outstanding musicians. One of those people went on to tell me later that he considers the harpsichord to be the most difficult instrument, which I had never really thought about. But the harpsichord is a very, very difficult instrument. I don't think it's a difficult instrument to listen to. I think it's a difficult instrument to play in a convincing manner, because I just think that it's something that has never been as developed as it could have been. Harpsichord playing went from a very it went from Wanda Landowska to Gustav Leonhardt, who had two very different personalities and who had two very different personalities and musical personalities. And they were, I suppose that at this point, that they were clearly the most outstanding harpsichordists of the 20th century, but with very, very different aesthetics, but both actually really rather extraordinary musicians. Most of Landowska's students were amateurs. I mean, of course, she had important students who were not amateurs, like Ralph Kirkpatrick and like Rafael Puyana, but most of her students were amateurs. Whereas Gustav Leonhardt's students mostly went on to be professional musicians, harpsichordists, organists, pedagogues. I mean, basically teaching his musical conceptions and conceptions about playing the harpsichord. So Leonhardt died in 2012. And then when Leonhardt was gone, the question really did, the question was, well, what is next? Not who is next, but what is next? Is there a way of going further? Are there things of really great beauty and great daring that even Leonhardt hadn't done because he didn't want to, or because they hadn't quite occurred to him? Landowska came from a school of late 19th century pianists. Leonhardt came from a musical aesthetic, as did Harnoncourt, for that matter, of the late 40s and 50s. So it has to do with what development tradition you're in when you're a young person and a young musician. It sort of dictates how daring or adventurous you'll be, or that you might become later in life. I always consider myself to be a bit, well, on the daring and adventurous side, but I really had no idea of how daring or adventurous I would actually get, especially concerning solo harpsichord playing. It happened. It was a question of decades and decades of playing the instrument and really being dedicated to how the instrument actually works and treating it like a musical instrument instead of a piece of furniture. It's also extremely important to treat the organ like a musical instrument instead of a piece of furniture. I mean, the gamba player, the violin player, the recorder player, they don't treat their instruments like a piece of furniture because, uh, yeah, because they're quite obviously musical instruments.
I mean, what I would ask you, Skip, is you asked, what's, the people coming after Leonhardt had to ask, what's next. But for you, Skip, what do you see as what's next? Given all of the evolution of playing, even in the last taste, traditional playing in the last 10, 20 years, you know, what's next in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, what I would like to see is an extremely disciplined liberty. I think that I would like to hear richer sounds on the harpsichord. I would like to hear more notes held down at the same time, because I think that the ultimate solution for really great harpsichord playing is in fact the ability of holding down as many notes at one time as possible. This is not thinking from the 1950s. Ralph Kirkpatrick told his students that he had read in treatises from the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, or what he could glean from the treatises that he read, is that uh, on the harpsichord, one note, you have to release a note before you attack the next note. And I think that that's a misreading of historical sources, because it gives you, uh, well, it gives it's not really obeying the sound of the instrument. I mean, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of ink spilled in the period instrument world about the instrument being the best teacher. And the instrument is an absolutely sensational teacher if you don't resist what it really wants to do. And the harpsichord is a loud, raucous instrument, especially at the moment that the fortepiano became popular, because composers were looking for an instrument that had a drier sound. And that's what the 5-octave Viennese piano gave them. It gave them a drier sound unless they lifted the dampers. And so I think that harpsichord sound is really based not on articulation, but having every note so perfectly timed that it actually sounds like you're playing with articulation, but what you're actually playing with is the resonance. And this is what I've been teaching for the last 20 years, and it's had a very powerful effect um, on harpsichord playing. I haven't taught it in conservatories. I've taught it basically in the academy that I founded along with Bruce Kennedy, the harpsichord maker, which is called the Piccola Accademia di Montisi. And we have had hundreds of students from all continents, every nationality, every school, through the master classes of the Piccola Accademia, in France, in Holland, in Italy. It has attracted an enormous amount of extremely talented students who have really had the opportunity of studying with the finest harpsichordists who do not currently teach in music conservatories. And that's a very, very important thing in how the harpsichord has evolved since 2006, and especially since Leonhardt died in 2012. Of course, Leonhardt was involved with the Piccola Accademia at the beginning as well. Uh, anyway, the harpsichord world has to keep moving, but everything has to keep everything has to keep moving. The Renaissance orchestra world has to keep moving. The recorder consort world has to keep moving. The viol consort world has to keep moving. Everything has to keep moving.
Well, on that note, Skip, I think we have to keep moving here because I think we've promised the audience that we tackle some of their questions, and we're almost at the top of the hour. Um, there have been a couple of interesting bits here. Maybe we'll start with a little bit of a whimsical question, which is, and I think that's something that you have some thought on, as given that you've been involved in the decoration of many instruments, you know, many of your own instruments, is you know, what's the most unusual or outrageous lid painting that you've ever observed on a harpsichord? Maybe just talk a little bit about how you approach harpsichord decoration.
Um, Somewhere in the United States, Igor Kipnis showed up with with a harpsichord, and he opened the lid on the stage, and there was a nude woman in the inside of the lid, and this amused everybody wildly. It was actually a very artistic photograph of the wife or the girlfriend, I can't really remember, of a rather well-known American harpsichord maker. So that was of of some interest. There's also an Italian instrument by Matthias Krivisch, which shows up in Holland from time to time, that has the same sort of inside lid painting, which amuses the audience when the instrument is opened, of course.
Of course. And I'll just note that, the subject of lid painting can be a very sensitive subject in the harpsichord community. Um, we also have a question here, which is, I guess, other than the Bible, is there a non-musical figure or source that's kind of that's been a towering influence on music or musical composition, in early music?
That's to say interesting books that have been written on early music. Well, the
Or I just
first,
mean, in terms of, obviously there's so much musical repertoire, which is, the sacred repertoire. But, are there other, yeah, like literature perhaps, I'm imagining, or
well, the contemporary writing on early music or period performance or period instruments began uh, with uh, with Landowska's book Musique ancienne, which was later translated into the book that became Landowska on music. And then, of course, Arnold Dolmetsch also did his book, which was mostly about his understandings about performance practice. And that began the 20th century tradition of writing books like that, and encyclopedic things. A lot of things after 1950 were influenced by the Bach reader, and uh, after that there were Hauenkort's books, which were all originally in German, which took a long time to be translated into English and into French. And then, of course, all the musicologists and all the historians who have done all of the musicological and scholarly journals.
we have a new question that just appeared. I guess, what are your thoughts on having to commit a single performance in a recording? When performing live, you can interpret something differently at each performance, but how limiting it is to commit to one quote unquote take for recording? Where's the future for recordings where we get choices as listeners? I think this kind of addresses some of these issues.
Well, I think that knowing exactly what you want on a recording is part of the process of making a really memorable recording. If you're if something is extremely pinched or conservative, uh, or self-conscious, um, that will be immediately, well, the audience can tell that immediately in a live performance. You can also tell it on a recording. But when the rehearsal procedure, when the whole concept of how any piece or number of pieces is going to happen, when the microphones are on, it just happens. It's almost like a live performance at that point. And some of the recordings that we've done in the last years have actually been live performances. They haven't all been studio recordings, and some recordings require very little editing, and other recordings require a bit more. It depends upon exactly what your relationship and what your dedication to the process of recording is. And once again, you can approach this as an amateur or as a professional. But I was always really, really interested, the point of obsession, with recordings, because of course I never heard Landowska live, who was a great influence on me when I was young, and I only heard Horowitz once, the last time he played in Paris at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, and so I knew these two great musicians who I absolutely worshipped because of their musical and artistic result. I really only ever heard them on recordings and saw them in photographs and knew about them from reading about them.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, on that note, I mean, obviously, there's this very recent recording project you've been involved in that's, we've briefly alluded to, but just, have there been any learnings through that, that have, I mean, with each recording you do, even the number of recordings you've worked on, I'm sure there are new facets to the process that you uncover.
Well, yes, I mean every recording is different because well the the team of instrumentalists or singers is different. Sometimes the acoustic is perfect. Sometimes the acoustic is a bit less perfect. We really try to record only in appropriate acoustics because it really is what makes the most faithful match to the sound um, that I'm looking for. But now we have a technique of recording. I mean, ever since we began Paradiso in 2006, actually by that time we already had a recording technique. Um, there was a producer, an ancient Hungarian, who was a wonderful, wonderful person and musician and recording producer who was called Thomas Gallia. And we made all of our first recordings for Deutsche Harmonie Mundi um, with Thomas Gallia, and he taught me how to record. He taught me how to get what I wanted. And the first recordings were analog. Uh, they were reel to reel recordings. They weren't digital, so it was analog splicing. And he had recorded a lot with Leonhardt and the Kaukens, La Petite Bande, but he had also recorded uh, with Blondine Verlet, who was extremely, extremely interested in the result, in the finished result of her recordings, and also with Jordi Sabal, who was also interested passionately in the finished in the finished product of his recordings. And so Thomas Gallia actually taught me how to do that. It's something that it's the sort of thing that I've been alluding to. You have to find the people who will teach you the things that will actually put you into the professional side of music making if that's what you're really doing. And he taught me how to do it. And he taught my friends around me in the instrumental ensemble how to do it. So the listening to takes, the choosing, it's something that I still do. It's work that I still share with the people in the instrumental ensemble of Capriccio Stravagante. We do it together, and of course, for the last 20 years, uh, we've only had two producers that we've worked with. And so our working relationship with them is so close that they know so much what we want that there's almost no interruption. It's almost like a live recording.
And so, I think we've reached noon here in California. So I think that's about all the time that we have today. But you're very modest. You can be very modest sometimes, Skip, because I just wanted to bring up to all of our viewers here that Skip and Capriccio Stravagante Renaissance Orchestra are coming out with in the process of coming out with a new recording of the Dowland's May that we mentioned earlier in May of next year. And currently there's a process to support that recording. And so if you're at all interested in Skip's work and Capriccio Stravagante, I'd encourage everyone to take a look at that, and if they can. But just anyway, Skip, it's been a pleasure every time we talk, every time you engage with audiences. I find it's a treat to watch and behold. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much to all of our international viewers. And look forward to many more years of Skip enlightening us, as well as many more years of us having conversations like this with brilliant folks such as Skip. So thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.